A billionaire buys flowers from a homeless girl with a baby strapped to her back. She hands him a photo and says, "It's for my sick dad. You look just like him." He takes one look and freezes. The man in the photo is identical to him. Under the concrete of the old railway bridge, Hallie tried to light the small makeshift stove. The wind kept snuffing out the match, but on the third attempt, the flame held. She placed a pot of water, the last she had in the gallon jug, and waited for it to boil so she could make tea for her dad. "Hallie, don't waste the water," Jake murmured from the pile of blankets where he lay. His face, once handsome, was now pale and etched with suffering. "Save it for Finn. We have enough, Dad," she replied, although she knew it wasn't true. The jug was almost empty, and the public water fountain in the park was a 20-minute walk away. The small space they called home consisted of a few blankets, 2 backpacks holding their meager belongings, and a lined cardboard box where Finn, the 8-month-old baby, was now sleeping. They had propped up a tarp for protection against wind and rain, creating a sort of tent against one of the bridge's pillars. It wasn't much, but it was better than public shelters, which often split up families. Jake groaned and turned over in the blankets. "It's worse today," he said through gritted teeth. Hallie knew what that meant. The medicine had run out 3 days ago, and they had no money to buy more. Without it, the pain returned at full force, leaving Jake unable to do even the occasional odd jobs he sometimes found. "I'll get money for the medicine today," Hallie promised, her voice firm despite being only 9 years old. "I have a plan." Jake tried to sit up, but the movement contorted his face in pain. "I don't want you begging in the streets, Hallie. It's dangerous." "I won't beg," she replied, handing him the mug of improvised tea. "I'm going to sell flowers." She pointed to a small bucket she had salvaged from a restaurant's trash and carefully cleaned. "I saw them in the park. A lot of flowers are blooming now that the rain is over." Jake looked at his daughter with a mix of pride and deep sadness. Ever since they lost their home a year ago, when he became too ill to work regularly, Hallie had been forced to grow up far too quickly. Losing Finn's mother during childbirth, 6 months after they became homeless, only sped up that process. Now she took care of both of them like a small adult, forgetting how to be a child. "Don't go too far," was all he could manage to say. Finn woke up and began to whimper. Hallie immediately went over to the makeshift box crib and picked him up. "He's hungry," she said, reaching for the last bottle they'd obtained from a charity center. "Take him with you," Jake whispered between coughing fits. "I'm not sure I can look after him today." Hallie bit her lip. She knew her dad was right. On days when the pain was severe, he could barely move, let alone care for a baby. "I'll take him," she agreed, picking up the large piece of colorful cloth her mother had left behind. It was the only keepsake she had of her, this and Finn's eyes, which were identical to hers. With skill born of practice, Hallie tied the cloth around her shoulders and back, creating a sort of sling. She placed the baby carefully inside. "I'll be back before dark," she promised. "Rest, Dad." The park was a 10-minute walk away. Hallie filled the bucket with the prettiest flowers she could find, avoiding the park guard who sometimes patrolled the area. Last time he caught her picking flowers, he threatened to call child services. "We'll get money for Dad's medicine," she whispered to Finn, who watched the world with curious eyes from her back. Hallie knew she needed to head to the wealthy side of the city. She walked for almost an hour, carrying a bucket full of flowers in one hand, occasionally adjusting the sling that kept Finn secure with the other. By the time she reached the avenue of skyscrapers, the midday sun gleamed on the glass buildings. People in expensive clothes hurried by, avoiding eye contact with her. 2 hours passed, and Hallie had sold only 2 flowers, earning a meager $10. Discouragement was creeping in when she saw a man leaving the biggest building on the avenue. Unlike the others, he wasn't looking at his phone, but at the sky, as if searching for something important in the clouds. Hallie approached, adjusting Finn on her back. There was something about the man's face that made her pause for a second, something strangely familiar. Evan Morgan left the building bearing his name with a nagging sense of emptiness he couldn't explain. Acquiring the largest pharmaceutical chain in the country was practically a done deal, another achievement to add to his impressive portfolio. "Mr. Morgan," his assistant called, puzzled. "The investors are waiting in the conference room." "Cancel," Evan replied abruptly. "I'm stepping out for a few hours." The assistant looked alarmed, but didn't dare question him. In 6 years of working for the billionaire, he'd never seen him cancel an important meeting on a whim. Evan strolled down the avenue, feeling the sun on his face. A strange impulse had driven him out of his office, simply to exist for a moment, away from his bubble of privilege. That was when he felt a slight tug on his coat. "A flower for my sick dad, sir." Evan looked down and saw a small child. She wore worn, dirty clothes and had a baby strapped to her back in a colorful sling. In her hands, a small bucket of wildflowers. Before he could respond, the girl extended a yellow daisy with one hand, and with the other offered a crumpled piece of paper. "It's to buy medicine for him," she said, unfolding the paper. "You look like him." Evan automatically took what she offered. The photograph showed a thin man sitting on a park bench, holding a newborn baby. He was smiling despite his obvious frailty. It wasn't a casual resemblance or a child's exaggeration. The man was identical to Evan. The same face shape, the same eyes, even the small mark near the left temple. It was like looking in a mirror reflecting a version of himself in another life, a life of poverty and hardship. Evan felt the blood drain from his veins. His hand clenched the photo until it crumpled further. A strange buzzing filled his ears as reality seemed to warp around him. "You look a lot like him," repeated the girl, watching his reaction. "We live under the old railroad bridge. He's too sick to work." Evan couldn't respond. He couldn't even think clearly. Mechanically, he pulled out his wallet. All he had were $100 bills. He took one out and handed it to the girl, still unable to look away from the photograph. The child's eyes went wide, fixed on the bill. "That's a lot of money," she said softly. "Thank you." What's your name?" Evan finally managed to ask, his voice sounding strange even to himself. "Hallie," she replied, carefully taking the photo back. "And this is my brother Finn." The baby on her back made a small noise, as though introducing himself as well. "Now I can buy my dad's medicine," Hallie said, tucking the money carefully into her torn pocket. "You're a good person." Evan wanted to ask more. Who was that man? How had he ended up on the streets? How could they look so alike? But no words came. He was paralyzed by the shock of what he'd just seen. "Have a good day, sir," Hallie said, already walking away with her bucket, now a bit lighter. Evan remained standing in the middle of the sidewalk, holding the yellow daisy, unable to move or call the girl back. In seconds, she disappeared into the crowd, leaving him with questions he never imagined he would have. The city continued its frantic pace around him. People on their phones, cars honking, life moving on. But for Evan Morgan, the lonely billionaire, nothing was normal anymore. Nothing made sense. He placed the flower carefully in the inside pocket of his suit, and for the first time in years, felt completely lost. The driver asked no questions when Evan got into the car. He was used to his employer's silences. But this silence was different, dense, almost tangible. "Home, sir?" the driver asked, looking in the rearview mirror. Evan nodded, unable to form words. His gaze was fixed on the yellow daisy he still held between his fingers, a simple flower, already beginning to wilt. A flower that had changed everything. For the entire ride, the image from the photo stayed sharp in his mind. A man with his face, not just a resemblance, identical. The same jawline, the same eyes, even the small mark near his temple that he'd always thought was unique. The mansion was empty and silent when he arrived. 5,000 square feet of luxury inhabited by a single person. Evan dismissed the housekeeper and chef, preferring solitude. He went straight to his study and locked the door, an unusual gesture for someone who rarely received visitors inside his own home anyway. He placed the flower on the mahogany desk and sat in the leather chair. On any other day, he would have immediately opened his laptop to check stock quotes or review contracts. Today, he just stared at the yellow flower, his mind trying to process what he had seen. "A man with my face," he muttered to the empty room. Evan had known he was adopted since he was 18. His adoptive parents told him the truth on his 18th birthday, handing him an envelope containing his adoption documents. But he'd never opened the envelope. He never wanted to know. His life was what he'd built, not what he'd left behind. Now, for the first time, he felt the weight of that decision. He stood and walked to the large bookshelf covering an entire wall. Pulling out an old book, revealed a small built-in safe. The combination was the date he'd made his first million-dollar deal, a moment he considered his true birth. From inside the safe, he removed a dark wooden box. He never opened it. It was the only remnant of his past he kept, a reluctant concession to a history he preferred to ignore. Sitting again, he opened the box. Inside were some old photographs. 10-year-old Evan with his adoptive parents in a formal portrait, his graduation the day he bought his first building. And below it all, a sealed, yellowed envelope. His adoption documents, the origin he never wanted to explore. For 20 years, that envelope had remained sealed. For 20 years, Evan Morgan had built an empire under the premise that the past didn't matter, only the future. But now his hands trembled as he held the envelope. The image of the man in that photograph, the man living under a bridge, sick, caring for 2 children, wouldn't leave his mind. It must be a coincidence, he told himself, but he knew he was lying. The similarity went beyond any statistical chance. It was the kind of likeness only explained by blood. His fingers hovered over the sealed edge of the envelope, hesitating. Inside were answers, names, dates, origins, maybe even mention of a brother, a twin, separated at birth. But then he pictured the little girl again, Hallie, a small child carrying a baby on her back, selling flowers to buy medicine for her dad, living under a bridge, bravely facing the big city at such a young age. Evan let the envelope fall back into the box. He didn't need old documents to understand what was happening. The answer was out there, alive, breathing in the same city. He closed the box and returned it to the safe. Going back to his desk, he opened his laptop and began typing. He wasn't searching for his adoption records, but for something more immediate. Abandoned railroad bridge. The search results revealed an old structure in the western part of the city, shut down 15 years ago when they built the new elevated line. Since then, it had become one of the largest homeless encampments in the area. Authorities periodically threatened to clear out the people living there but never followed through. It was a problem no one wanted to tackle. Evan zoomed in on the satellite image, imagining what that place looked like. Imagining Hallie, Finn, and the man with his face living under the concrete pillars, shielded only by improvised tarps and donated blankets. The difference between their lives was absurd. While he slept on Egyptian cotton sheets, they slept on hard ground. While he dined at Michelin-starred restaurants, they probably went hungry. While his biggest concern was closing million-dollar deals, they fought daily for survival, and yet they shared the same face, the same blood. The implications were unsettling. If that man was indeed his brother, perhaps a twin, then why had their lives diverged so drastically? Why had Evan been adopted by a middle-class family who gave him an education and opportunities, while the other, what exactly had happened to him? Abandoned by the system, adopted into a different family. What had led them to such different fates? He closed the laptop and walked to the window. From his top-floor office, he had a panoramic view of the city. Lights sparkled in every direction, like a field of stars. Somewhere beneath that glowing tapestry, 3 people slept under a bridge, one of them wearing his face. The phone rang, his assistant most likely worried about his abrupt departure earlier. Evan didn't pick up. For the first time in years, business, meetings, and acquisitions felt insignificant. Night fell. Evan remained awake, his mind a storm of unanswered questions. Who was this man? How did he end up on the streets? What had happened to him, and more importantly, what should Evan do now? The most logical answer would be to ignore it. Pretend he never saw the photo, never met Hallie. continue his life as before, isolated in his tower of glass and steel, shielded by money and power. But another part of him, a part he didn't know existed until that day, refused to accept that solution. A part that, despite all his efforts to sever any connection to the past, now screamed to be heard. When the sun began to rise, Evan was still standing by the window. He hadn't slept, hadn't eaten. He had only thought, remembered, questioned. In his hand, the yellow daisy was completely wilted now, but its meaning remained intact, a symbol of an encounter that shouldn't have happened, a connection that wasn't supposed to exist. Evan placed the flower carefully on the desk. Perhaps he should throw it away, like he did with everything else that was no longer useful. But he couldn't. Instead, he grabbed a heavy book from the shelf, a first edition Hemingway he'd never read, and placed the flower between its pages. An unlikely way to preserve something that suddenly felt precious. He changed his clothes, choosing jeans and a simple shirt instead of the usual tailored suit. He didn't know exactly what he would do, but he knew he had to do something. He needed answers that no old document could give him. He left the mansion as the first rays of sunlight touched the horizon, ignoring the flood of messages on his phone, the packed schedule, the empire demanding his constant attention. For the first time since he became Evan Morgan the billionaire, he was following something other than ambition. He was following a question that now refused to let him rest. A question about identity, about origins, about connections that ran deeper than conscious choices. A question about who he really was. The old railroad bridge cast a long shadow over the land beneath it. Evan adjusted the simple jacket he wore, an item his assistant had bought specifically for this occasion, and moved forward cautiously. This was not a place someone like him would normally set foot in. 3 days had passed since his encounter with the girl, 3 days in which the image of the man in the photo, the face identical to his, had never left his mind. His corporate empire was temporarily adrift. Meetings cancelled, calls unanswered, the pharmaceutical acquisition seeming insignificant compared to what he might discover here. The encampment under the bridge was larger than he'd imagined, dozens of makeshift tents, tarps tied to pillars, belongings piled in shopping carts, a small invisible settlement existing in the shadows of the prosperous city. Some people eyed him with suspicion as he approached. His posture, his haircut, his uncalloused hands, everything about him screamed he was an outsider. "I'm looking for a girl," Evan said, addressing a group gathered around a barrel with a weak fire burning inside. "Hallie, she carries her baby brother on her back." Silence. Suspicious glances. Finally, an elderly woman sitting in a broken plastic chair looked up. "The girl with the baby. She stays down at the far end, near the cracked pillar," the woman said, pointing with a crooked knitting needle. "Thank you," Evan replied. "She's a good kid," the woman added. "Takes care of her brother and her sick father like an adult. Don't hurt her." The warning made Evan pause. "I won't hurt anyone," he promised. "I just want to help." Following the direction indicated, he found a small blue tarp stretched between a pillar and a concrete wall. Beside it was a cardboard box turned into an improvised crib. There was no one in sight. While he waited, his eyes took in details of the precarious dwelling. A plastic bottle cut in half served as a container for miscellaneous objects, a pair of worn baby shoes, a hand-drawn picture taped to the tarp, a house with a tree, and 3 stick figures smiling. That was when he saw her coming from the other side of the encampment, Hallie, and with Finn strapped to her back, carrying a plastic jug of water. She noticed him immediately, stopping a few steps away. "You're the flower man," she said, neither surprised nor afraid, just stating a fact. "Hello, Hallie?" Evan replied, feeling strangely nervous. "I came to see how you're doing." Her eyes studied him with a disconcerting intensity for someone so young. "Because of your face that looks like my dad's," Evan nodded. "Yes, I thought we should talk." Hallie glanced at the jug in her hands, then at the tarp that served as a home. "My dad's really bad today. His medicine ran out again." "I can help," Evan said immediately. "I can buy more medicine and food, whatever you need." "Why?" Hallie interrupted, her small voice firm. Why do you care about us? It was a fair question. Why did he care? Why had he obsessed over this family he didn't even know? Because I think your dad and I might be relatives, he answered honestly. Maybe brothers. The resemblance is too strong to be a coincidence. Hallie considered his reply. The baby on her back made a small noise, and she instinctively adjusted the sling that held him. He needs a doctor, she said finally. Not just medicine, he's worse than other times. I can take him to a hospital right now, Evan replied without hesitation. The best hospital in the city. Hallie hesitated, torn between distrust and the urgent need for help. I have to ask him first, she decided. Evan nodded. Of course, she pointed to a broken bench a few steps away. Wait there. Obeying, Evan watched Hallie disappear under the blue tarp. The following minutes felt like hours. Around him, life under the bridge continued in its own rhythm, a world entirely different from his bay, separated not only by distance but by a gulf of privilege. Finally, Hallie came out of the tent. He said, "You can come in." The space under the tarp was so small that Evan had to stoop to enter. The smell hit him immediately, a mix of sweat, urine, and something chemical he couldn't identify. In the far corner, on a thin mattress covered with worn blankets, lay a man. And then time stopped. Even in the dim light, even with the man obviously sick and debilitated, the impact was immediate and overwhelming. It was like looking into a distorted mirror, not just his face, but an entire alternate life, a path not taken. The same eyes, now sunken and yellowish, the same nose, the same face shape, even the small scar above the right eyebrow. It wasn't just a resemblance, it was identical. My God, Evan muttered involuntarily. The man on the mattress tried to sit up, but the movement clearly caused him pain. His skin had a sickly yellow tone, and his eyes were bloodshot. When he spoke, his voice was rough, almost a whisper. "Who are you?" "My name is Evan Morgan," he replied, still struggling to process what he was seeing. "Your daughter found me a few days ago and showed me your photo." The man studied Evan's face intensely. "Jake Carter," he finally said, extending a trembling hand. "But I guess you knew that already." Evan clasped the offered hand, lighter and warmer than normal, the skin dry as paper. "Yes, Hallie told me." A heavy silence fell between them, laden with unspoken questions. Jake was the one to break the silence first. "Adopted?" The simplicity of the question hit Evan like a punch. "Yes, at 6 months. You?" Jake nodded weakly. "At 2 years old. The Carter family." "The Morgan family," Evan replied automatically. Hallie looked from one to the other, as if watching a tennis match. Finn started to fuss in her arms, and she picked him up, soothing him. Jake tried to move again and squeezed his eyes shut, clearly fighting pain. His face, Evan's face, twisted in a grimace. "You're not well," Evan said. "You need a doctor." "I don't have a way to pay," Jake answered simply. "I'll pay," Evan said without hesitation. "Everything. Doctors, hospital, meds, whatever you need." Jake looked at him warily. "Why?" It was the same question Hallie had asked, a question Evan still didn't have a complete answer for. "Because looking at you is like looking at myself," he finally said, "and I can't just turn my back on that." Jake scrutinized Evan's face for a long moment, as though searching for any trace of deceit. Then his gaze shifted to Hallie, who was holding Finn against her chest. "I can't leave them alone," he said, his voice nearly gone. "I've got no one else." "They can come too," Evan replied. "We'll all go to the hospital together." The skepticism in Jake's eyes was palpable. In his world, offers of help rarely came without a price, but another spasm of pain seized him, forcing him to curl up on himself. "Dad!" Hallie exclaimed, rushing over. "Please let him help." Jake closed his eyes for a moment, breathing hard. When he opened them again, something had changed, reluctant acceptance of reality. "Okay," he whispered, "but all of us together." "All of us together," Evan confirmed. The next few minutes were a blur of activity. Evan called a private ambulance, using his name to ensure an immediate response. While they waited, he helped Jake sit up, offering his shoulder for support. The physical contact felt strange, almost surreal. It was like supporting a version of himself from a parallel universe, the same bone structure, the same height, yet Jake's body was so light, so fragile compared to his own. "You're strong," Jake murmured as he leaned on him. "Like I used to be." The statement hit Evan in an unexpected way. Jake wasn't just a less fortunate version of him. He was a version worn down by time and illness, nearly destroyed. Hallie ran back and forth, gathering the few essential items: an empty baby bottle, diapers for Finn, a photograph, the medicine prescription. "It's okay," Evan said. "We can buy whatever else is needed later." Hallie shook her head firmly. "These are our things," she replied, as if it were obvious. When the ambulance arrived, the paramedics briefly hesitated upon seeing Jake and Evan side by side. The resemblance was unsettling even to trained professionals. "Are they twins?" one paramedic asked. "Maybe," Evan answered, because any other reply would require explanations he himself still didn't have. "Blood pressure 80/50, jaundiced skin and sclera, swelling in the extremities," the paramedic noted while conducting the initial exam. "Possible advanced kidney failure." As they placed Jake on the stretcher, Hallie remained by his side, holding Finn in one arm and her father's hand with the other. Her eyes never left his face. "Come on, honey," Evan said gently. "We'll be with him the whole time." On the way to the hospital, Evan held Hallie's hand, who in turn held Finn. A human chain connecting four people who, until a few days ago, didn't even know one another existed. Jake was semi-conscious on the stretcher, masks and tubes covering part of his face. The paramedics worked methodically, checking vitals, inserting an IV. "Is he going to be okay?" Hallie asked, her small voice almost lost amid the siren's wail. Evan looked at the child, who gripped his hand with sudden trust. A child forced to grow up too soon, care too much, worry too often. "We'll do everything we can," he answered honestly. "He's going to the best hospital, with the best doctors." The hospital received them with cold efficiency. The Morgan name opened doors, guaranteed immediate care, summoned specialists. Within minutes, Jake was taken for tests, leaving Evan, Hallie, and Finn in a private waiting room. "We need more information," a doctor said, approaching them. "Medical history, medications, allergies." "Ask his daughter," Evan said, indicating Hallie. And so Hallie, still holding Finn, answered the doctor's questions with surprising precision for someone so young. Blood type, medications, when the symptoms began, how long Jake had been ill. "Chronic kidney failure," the doctor explained. "He's in an advanced stage. He should have been on regular dialysis." "Why did it stop?" "We didn't have money," Hallie answered simply. "And he couldn't get to the clinic anymore. It's too far from the bridge." The doctor looked at Evan, clearly confused by the situation. A wealthy man who apparently didn't know basic medical details about someone so obviously related to him. "We've only just reconnected," Evan said vaguely. "And money won't be an issue anymore. Do whatever it takes." When Jake was taken away for further tests, Evan and Hallie were left alone in the waiting room. Finn slept deeply, as if sensing that he was finally in a safe place. The silence between them was heavy, filled with unasked questions. "Thank you," Hallie said at last, "for helping my dad." Evan nodded, unable to articulate the whirlwind of emotions swirling inside him. Of all the directions his life could have taken that week, finding a possible twin brother who was ill and two children in desperate need of help certainly wasn't on his agenda. And yet, sitting next to that little girl who held her sleeping brother so protectively, Evan felt something he couldn't fully name. Something that, instinctively, he knew would change his life forever. "You know," Hallie said suddenly, looking down the corridor where her dad had disappeared, "he always told me I should believe in angels. That they show up when we need them most." She looked at Evan, her tired eyes still bright. "I think he was right." Evan didn't know how to respond. He, who always had a ready answer, found himself speechless in front of this child who saw in him something he never imagined he could be. Not a billionaire, not a name in a business magazine, but someone who might be family. The hospital waiting room had become Hallie's new home for the past 2 days. A grey faux leather sofa served as her bed at night, when exhaustion finally overcame her resolve to stay awake. A small coffee table was covered in food packaging that Evan insisted she eat, even when she wasn't hungry. In the corner, a plastic chair held the worn backpack with the few belongings they'd brought from under the bridge. That was where Evan found her once again, perched on the edge of the sofa, rocking Finn in her small arms. Her eyes were fixed on the door leading to the ICU corridor, as if by sheer willpower she could see through it and reach her dad. "Good morning, Hallie," Evan said softly, placing a bag with new clothes and some toys for the baby beside her. Over the last 2 days, he'd sent his assistant to buy everything 2 kids might need, though Hallie accepted only the essentials. She glanced up briefly. "Did you talk to the doctors?" Always the same question. The first thing she asked whenever Evan arrived, no matter the time of day. Over the past 48 hours, Evan had learned Hallie kept her routine with near-military precision. She woke at 6 a.m., washed her face, brushed her teeth with the hygiene kit a kind nurse had given her, changed Finn, fed him, and then sat in the same spot, waiting. "Yes," Evan answered, sitting next to her. "I spoke with Dr. Reynolds. He's coming to talk to us in a few minutes." Jake's condition was severe, as Evan had suspected. Advanced chronic kidney failure, complicated by an infection that had spread quickly due to his compromised immune system. The medical team worked tirelessly to stabilize him before addressing long-term treatment options. For Evan, the past 2 days had been an emotional roller coaster. Discovering that Jake was almost certainly his twin had upended his internal world. Preliminary tests confirmed what their eyes had already told them. They shared enough DNA to be identical. How they'd been separated, why and under what circumstances remained a mystery they would have to unravel together, if Jake survived. Finn began to fuss, and Hallie shifted him in her arms, murmuring soothing words. At least the baby seemed relatively unaware of the drama around him, as long as he was fed and close to his sister. "You're tired," Evan observed, noting the deep circles under her eyes. "I'm fine," she replied automatically, the same answer she'd given for the last 48 hours whenever he showed concern. "Hallie," Evan began cautiously. This was a conversation he'd been mentally rehearsing since the previous night, when Dr. Reynolds pulled him aside to express concern about the little girl and the baby, practically living in the waiting room. "I think we need to talk about you and Finn." Her eyes immediately narrowed in suspicion. "We're not going to a shelter. Dad always said they split families up. That's why we stayed under the bridge." "No, that's not it," Evan hurried to say. "I'm not talking about shelters." "Then what?" she asked, her small voice hardened by an experience no child should have to endure. "Child welfare? Foster homes?" Evan took a deep breath. He should have known this wouldn't be an easy conversation. Hallie had spent her life learning to distrust authorities, institutions, anyone representing the system that repeatedly failed her family. "I'm talking about my house," he finally said. "I have a lot of space. You two could stay with me while your dad is in the hospital." Hallie was silent for a long moment, her gaze shifting from Evan to the ICU doors and back again. Finn stirred in her arms, and she instinctively rocked him, a movement as natural as breathing. "No," she said at last. "I need to stay close to my dad." "A hospital isn't a place for children to live, Hallie," Evan tried to explain gently. "Especially not for a baby. Finn needs a more stable, comfortable environment." "He's fine here," she insisted. "We're fine." "We've been through worse." Evan's heart clenched at those words. What had this child already faced in her short life to consider living in a hospital waiting room acceptable? "I'm sure you have," he said softly. "But you don't have to anymore. Not while I can help." Her eyes met his, evaluating him with that unnerving intensity that seemed to see beyond words. "Why?" she asked, the same question she'd posed many times in the last few days. "Why are you helping us?" It was a question Evan still didn't fully know how to answer. Or maybe he did. But the answer was so simple, yet so complicated, he didn't know how to articulate it to a child. "Because your dad is my brother," he replied, opting for simplicity. "That makes you my niece and Finn my nephew, and family takes care of family." Something flickered in Hallie's eyes, an emotion quickly suppressed. "You didn't even know us 3 days ago," she pointed out, her logic as impeccable as ever. "True," Evan agreed, "but now I do, and I can't just ignore it." Before Hallie could respond, the ICU door opened, and Dr. Reynolds stepped into the waiting room. He was a middle-aged man with grey hair at the temples, and an expression that balanced compassion and professionalism. "Mr. Morgan, Hallie," he greeted them, pulling up a chair to sit facing them. "I have some updates on Jake." Hallie immediately straightened, her eyes locked on the doctor. "Is he awake?" "Not yet, Doctor," Reynolds replied kindly. "But there's progress. The infection is responding to antibiotics, and his kidney levels have shown slight improvement in the last 12 hours. "So he's going to get better?" Hallie asked, a note of hope in her voice for the first time in 2 days. The doctor exchanged a brief look with Evan before replying, "Your dad is very ill, Hallie. The kidney failure is chronic, meaning it's a long-term condition. We're treating this crisis, but he'll need ongoing care." "What kind of care?" Evan asked, though he suspected the answer. "Regular dialysis, to start," the doctor explained, "and eventually the best solution would be a kidney transplant." Hallie frowned, trying to process the information. "How long will he stay in the hospital?" "At least another 2 weeks, maybe more," the doctor answered. "First, we need to fully stabilize him, treat the infection, and then start a regular dialysis schedule." Evan saw the weight of that information settle on Hallie's small shoulders. 2 weeks. 2 weeks living in a waiting room, caring for a baby, worried about her dad. "Dr. Reynolds," Evan said, "I'm trying to convince Hallie and Finn to stay at my home while Jake is hospitalized. I think it would be better for both of them." The doctor nodded. "It would be much more appropriate, indeed. Honestly, I've been concerned. A hospital isn't a suitable environment for children over a long period, especially a baby." Hallie hugged Finn closer to her. "But what if he needs me? What if he wakes up and I'm not here?" "We can visit every day," Evan offered. "I promise, morning and afternoon if you'd like. And if there's any change, the hospital has my number. We can be here in minutes." "Also," Dr. Reynolds added, "when your dad starts to get better, it'll be important that you and your brother are well rested and healthy. That will help him recover." Hallie looked around the waiting room, the uncomfortable sofa, the fluorescent lights that never fully dimmed, the constant coming and going of strangers. "I don't want to leave him alone," she said, her voice a near whisper. "He's not alone," Dr. Reynolds assured. "We have an entire team looking after him, 24 hours a day." "And I'll be here when you're not," Evan added, the offer escaping his lips before he could think twice. "I can work remotely from the hospital while you're at home with Finn." Hallie lifted her eyes, surprised. "You'd do that?" "Of course," Evan answered, realizing with sudden clarity that he truly would. He'd reorganize his schedule, delegate meetings, work late if needed. But he wouldn't leave Jake alone. He wouldn't leave this child worried. A hush settled over the room as Hallie considered his proposal. Finn began fussing again, likely hungry. As if sensing her indecision, his cry grew more insistent. "I have to feed him," Hallie said, standing. "Want me to hold him while you prepare the bottle?" Evan offered, extending his arms hesitantly. To his surprise, after a moment of thought, Hallie handed the baby to him. It was the first time she'd trusted Finn to anyone else. His small body, warm and heavy in Evan's arms, felt incredibly fragile. Evan adjusted him carefully, recalling vaguely how to hold a newborn from years ago, when one of his executives brought their infant to the office. While Hallie prepared the formula the nurse had given them, Evan looked at Finn's face. He saw something of Jake there, or was it himself, in the shape of the nose, the arch of the brow. Genetics was extraordinary. This little being somehow shared his blood indirectly. "I'm ready," Hallie said, coming over to take Finn back. "Do you want me to try?" Evan asked, surprising even himself again. Hallie hesitated, then handed him the bottle, staying close, supervising every move. "Hold his head higher," she instructed, "and tilt the bottle so he doesn't swallow air." Evan obeyed, watching with fascination as Finn sucked eagerly, his curious eyes fixed on Evan's face with unwavering focus. "How do you have kids?" Hallie asked suddenly. "No," Evan replied. "I never married. I was always too busy working." "Dad says work isn't everything," Hallie commented, settling back in her seat. "He says people matter more than money." The simple words hit Evan with unexpected force. Jake, living under a bridge, teaching his daughter that people were more important than money. And Evan in his empty mansion, with overflowing bank accounts but lacking real connections. "Your dad is a wise man," he answered sincerely. After Finn finished his bottle, Hallie showed Evan how to gently place the baby against his shoulder and pat his back. When a small burp followed by a satisfied sigh emerged, Evan couldn't help but smile. "You're a natural at this," Hallie remarked, a rare note of approval in her voice. "I have an excellent teacher," Evan replied, handing Finn back to her arms. Hallie gazed at her brother for a long moment, then at the ICU door and finally at Evan. "If we go to your house," she said slowly, each word weighed carefully, "you have to promise some things." "Sure," Evan answered, trying not to show the relief he felt. "First, we come see my dad every day. No exceptions. I promise. Second, if the doctors call, no matter the time, you bring us immediately. Of course. Third," she continued, her tone indicating this was the most important condition of all, "you're not going to call any child services or try to take us away from my dad. We're a family, and we stay together." The fierceness of loyalty and love in that small person was almost overwhelming. At just 9 years old, Hallie understood and defended values many adults never learned. "Hallie," Evan said seriously, looking straight into her eyes, "I promise I'd never do anything to separate you. In fact, I want to help keep you three together, safer and healthier." She studied him for a long moment, her eyes searching for any sign of falsehood. Finally, she nodded. "Okay," she said simply. "We can go to your house, but only while Dad's in the hospital." "Deal," Evan replied, extending his hand as if sealing a business agreement. Hallie shook his hand with comic seriousness. "When can we see my dad before we leave?" "I'll talk to Dr. Reynolds," Evan said, rising to his feet. "I'm sure we can take a quick look at him now." As the doctor guided them down the ICU hallway, Evan felt Hallie's small hand slip into his. That simple gesture, so small and deeply meaningful, caused a surge of emotion he hadn't expected. It was a vote of confidence, though cautious, from a child who'd learned the hard way that trusting people could be risky. When they reached Jake's ICU room door, Hallie hesitated. "It's okay," Evan reassured. "I'm right here with you." She nodded, tightening her grip on his hand slightly, and together they entered to see Jake. The sight of his newly discovered brother hooked up to tubes and monitors, pale and unconscious but fighting to stay alive, solidified something inside Evan, a resolve that went beyond any promise made to Hallie, beyond any sense of newly found familial obligation. He would take care of these three people. Not just now, not just during Jake's hospitalization, but as long as they allowed him to, for as long as it took. And maybe, in the process, he'd learn what Jake already knew, that people really were more important than money. Evan Morgan's mansion, with its 6 bedrooms, indoor pool and high-tech security system, had never housed children. The echo of small footsteps on the marble floors was a completely new sound, as was the occasional cry of a baby breaking the silence at odd hours. A week had passed since Hallie and Finn temporarily moved in. The first night was the hardest. Hallie barely slept, sitting on the edge of the guest room bed Evan had prepared for her, on guard like a little soldier in enemy territory. Finn, surprisingly, adapted more easily, sleeping soundly in the newly delivered crib. As promised, Evan took them to the hospital twice a day. Jake remained in the ICU, but showed small signs of improvement. He woke briefly a few times, recognizing Hallie and squeezing her small hand before drifting off again. The doctors said it was normal. His body needed rest to recover. It was after one of those visits, while it drizzled softly outside, that something changed. Hallie was seated in the enormous kitchen, watching Evan attempt, with questionable results, to prepare macaroni and cheese for dinner. The housekeeper had been given time off at Hallie's request, as she felt uncomfortable with strangers around. "Have you never cooked before?" she asked, watching with fascination as Evan struggled to open a simple box of pasta. "Actually, no," he admitted, finally tearing the packaging with more force than necessary, sending a few noodles scattering across the counter. "I usually order takeout or have the housekeeper do it." Hallie swung her legs from the high chair. "I can help. I used to cook for Dad sometimes when he was too tired." The offer, presented so naturally, struck Evan. The idea of a child so small having to cook to survive was painful. "I think that would be great," he responded, trying to keep his tone light. "A private cooking lesson." With Finn safely asleep and a baby monitor placed on the counter, Hallie guided Evan through the surprisingly intricate process of making macaroni and cheese the right way, as she explained. Her confidence in the kitchen starkly contrasted with her shyness elsewhere in the house. "Dad always adds a little mustard," she instructed, as serious as a head chef. "Gives it a special flavor." "Where'd you learn that?" Evan asked, obediently stirring a bit of mustard into the sauce. "From my mom," Hallie replied, her voice dropping a bit. Before she left. It was the first time she'd mentioned her mother. Until then, Hallie had only talked about Jake and Finn, as though it had always just been the three of them. "Did your mom like cooking?" Evan asked cautiously, keeping his tone casual while he stirred the sauce. Hallie was quiet for a moment, stirring a spoon in her own cup of milk. "She didn't leave on purpose," she finally said, her small voice trembling. "She died when Finn was born." The impact of those simple words made Evan stop stirring. He looked at Hallie, who was staring into her cup. "I'm so sorry, Hallie," he said genuinely. "That must have been very hard." "Dad cried for many days," she continued, as if now that she'd started, she needed to tell the whole story. "He used to say I looked like her. Then we stopped talking about it. It was too sad for him." Evan turned off the stove. The pasta could wait. He took a seat on the stool beside her. "What about you? Was it sad for you, too?" Hallie shrugged, a gesture meant to be casual, but failing to hide the hurt. "Sometimes I forget what her face looked like," she confessed. "We had a photo, but we lost it when we got evicted from our first apartment." "When was that?" Evan asked. "After Finn was born. Dad couldn't work as much because he had to take care of both of us, and he got sick." She swung her legs again. "Then we had to move out. We lived in a lot of places. The last one was under the bridge." The concise way Hallie described the total collapse of her stable life was both impressive and heartbreaking. "How long did you live under the bridge?" 5 months, I think," she answered thoughtfully. "It's hard to keep track of time there. All the days look the same." Evan was silent, trying to absorb it all. The tragedy this family had endured, a mother dying in childbirth, a father too ill to work, eviction, extreme poverty, was almost incomprehensible to someone like him, who never had to worry about money or safety. "Nights were the worst," Hallie continued, voice now a near whisper. "It was cold and Finn cried a lot. Dad tried to keep us warm even when he was trembling. He always said things would get better, that one day we'd have a home again." She looked around the massive kitchen with its gleaming appliances and marble counters. "I guess he never imagined a house like this," she added with a small smile. Evan felt a lump in his throat. "Hallie, you're a very brave girl. Did you know that?" She shrugged again. "It's not bravery. It's just what had to be done." The profound simplicity of her answer struck Evan like lightning. In all his years in the corporate world, surrounded by ambitious people competing for power and recognition, he'd never encountered such strength of character. The baby monitor let out a soft sound, Finn stirring in his sleep. Hallie immediately glanced at the device, her sense of responsibility never truly resting. "He's fine," Evan assured. "He just rolled over." "He does that," Hallie said. "He moves a lot in his sleep." "Just like Jake," Evan commented, remembering noticing his brother tossing restlessly in the hospital bed, even while sedated. Hallie looked at him curiously. "Do you do that too?" "Actually, yes," Evan admitted, never making the connection before. "My housekeeper complains that every morning the sheets are completely messed up." A genuine smile lit Hallie's face, a precious rarity that Evan was learning to treasure. "So it's a family thing," she said, accepting the new kinship between them with a simple statement. "Genetics." "Yes," Evan agreed, feeling an unusual warmth in his chest. "It runs in the family." They finished cooking the macaroni together, with Hallie patiently guiding Evan not to overcook the pasta. When they finally sat down to eat, the result wasn't restaurant-quality pies, but they had made it, together. "This is nice," Hallie said after a few minutes of comfortable silence. "Not the pasta. It's kind of sticky." "Hey!" Evan protested in mock indignation. "It's nice being here," she continued, ignoring his interruption. "Having a real bed, hot water. Not worrying about rain or bad people." The simplicity with which she appreciated things Evan had always taken for granted was humbling. "Thank you," she added quietly, looking down at her plate. "For helping us, and for helping Dad." "You don't have to thank me, Hallie," Evan answered, feeling that nothing he said could ever be enough. "I'm glad I found you." And he realized, somewhat surprised, that it was true. His life before now felt empty, filled only with meetings, acquisitions, and the endless pursuit of more wealth. In the last week, learning to change diapers, listening to Hallie's stories, visiting Jake at the hospital, he felt more alive and connected than he had in years. "When Dad gets better," Hallie said suddenly, "will you still want to see us?" The question, so direct and vulnerable, struck Evan to his core. For the first time, he understood completely that this was not temporary. It wasn't just a charitable act or a genetic curiosity to be examined and then forgotten. It was the beginning of something much bigger, something that would continue for the rest of their lives. "Hallie, you're my family," he replied, discovering the truth as he spoke. "Of course I'll want to see you. Always." She nodded, as though confirming something she already suspected. "Good, because I think Finn likes you. And Dad will need help until he's completely well." "And you?" Evan asked, trying to sound casual but feeling the answer mattered more than he could explain. "Do you like me too?" Hallie studied him with those ancient eyes in a young face. "You're weird," she decided finally. "You can't cook and you have way too many things you don't even use. But you're nice. And you look like Dad, not just on the outside." Coming from Hallie, it was the highest praise he could receive. That night, after putting Finn to sleep, a task at which he was becoming surprisingly competent, Evan paused at Hallie's bedroom door. She was already in bed but still awake, looking at the window where the rain softly tapped. "Everything okay?" he asked. "Just thinking about Dad," she answered. "Do you think he's cold?" "No," Evan assured her. "Hospitals are kept pretty warm, and he has a lot of blankets." Hallie nodded, seeming relieved. "Good night, Uncle Evan." It was the first time she called him that, Uncle Evan, a title he never expected to have, a connection he never knew he wanted. "Good night, Hallie," he replied, voice slightly hoarse. "Sleep well." As he softly closed the door, Evan realized that something fundamental had shifted inside him. For years, he'd defined himself by what he owned, what he achieved, the empire he built. Now, suddenly, he found himself defined by who he was to other people. An uncle, a brother, maybe auntie, eventually a friend. For the first time in his adult life, Evan Morgan felt he belonged to something bigger than himself, something no bank account or corporate acquisition could ever provide. A family. The routine of hospital visits had become almost second nature. Every morning after breakfast, Evan drove Hallie and Finn to see Jake. Over the past 2 weeks, They'd witnessed small improvements, Jake waking for longer periods, managing brief conversations, even smiling when Hallie described her day. But that morning, something was different. As they arrived at the hospital, a nurse informed them that Dr. Reynolds wanted to speak with Evan before the visit. "Just me?" Evan asked, glancing at Hallie, who immediately tensed up. "The doctor said he'd like to talk first with the adults," the nurse explained gently. "Is something wrong with my dad?" Hallie asked, her voice carrying a fear no child should know so intimately. "He's stable," the nurse assured her, "but Dr. Reynolds wants to discuss his treatment." Evan crouched to be at Hallie's eye level. "How about you and Finn wait in the playroom? They have those books you liked last time." "I want to go with you," Hallie insisted, holding Finn closer. "I know," Evan said softly, "but I promise I'll tell you everything afterward, every detail. And if it's something important about your dad, you'll be the first to know." After several seconds of internal deliberation, Hallie reluctantly nodded. "Okay, but come back soon." As the nurse led the children to the pediatric playroom, Evan walked down the corridor to Dr. Reynolds' office, trying to control the surge of anxiety. Private meetings rarely brought good news. The doctor greeted him with a firm handshake, gestured for him to sit, and got straight to the point. "Mr. Morgan, Jake's kidney situation is more serious than we initially evaluated," he began, flipping through a file. "Dialysis is keeping him stable, but it's not a long-term solution, not with the current state of his kidneys." Evan felt a tightening in his chest. "What does that mean exactly?" "It means he needs a kidney transplant, and relatively soon." The words hung in the air like a sentence. Evan knew Jake's condition was serious, but he had hoped standard treatment would suffice. "How much time does he have?" Dr. Reynolds hesitated. "Without a transplant, hard to pinpoint, months, maybe a year, with continuous dialysis. But his quality of life would be drastically reduced. The damage is already extensive, and the infection he had only sped up the deterioration." "What about his chances of finding a matching donor?" Evan asked, though he suspected the answer. "Waiting lists are long," the doctor explained. "We could prioritize him based on severity, but even then, it could take time. Time he might not have." Evan took a deep breath, absorbing the implications. The idea that had been forming in his mind since discovering Jake was likely his twin now crystallized into a certainty. "What about a living donor? A relative?" The doctor eyed him with renewed interest. "That would be ideal. Compatibility would be much higher, and we could proceed as soon as he's stable enough." "We're twins," Evan said simply, "or so it seems, based on the tests we've done. That would make me the perfect donor, right?" "Theoretically, yes," Dr. Reynolds agreed, a spark of hope in his eyes. "Identical twins would mean a perfect match. But Mr. Morgan, donating a kidney is a serious decision. There are risks, recovery, lifestyle changes." "What do I need to do to be tested as a donor?" Evan interrupted, already decided. The doctor studied him a moment, then nodded. "We'd need full exams. Blood work, tissue matching, evaluating your renal function, plus a general checkup to ensure you're healthy enough for surgery." "Let's start today," Evan said firmly. "Mr. Morgan," Dr. Reynolds spoke with caution, "I appreciate your willingness, but it's important you fully understand what this entails. Recovery takes weeks. You'll need to make permanent changes to your diet, exercise regimen." "Doctor," Evan interrupted again, "I understand your concerns, but 3 weeks ago, I didn't even know Jake existed. Now, I can't imagine a world where he isn't around for Hallie and Finn." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "If our roles were reversed, I'm sure he'd do the same for me." Something softened in the doctor's expression. "It's rare to see such commitment, especially under such unusual circumstances." "Family isn't defined by how long you've known each other," Evan replied, surprised by the conviction in his own voice. "It's defined by what you're willing to do for one another." 40 minutes later, Evan had signed consent forms and been directed to the lab, where they took multiple blood samples. The transplant team promised preliminary results within 48 hours. With his head spinning from medical information and potential outcomes, Evan headed to the playroom to find Hallie and Finn. He found her in a corner, reading to her brother, who watched the colorful pictures with rapt attention. "You took a while," she said, looking up with that serious expression that made her seem older than her 9 years. "Sorry," Evan replied, sitting on a child-sized chair beside her. There was a lot to discuss. Hallie closed the book slowly, her eyes never leaving Evan's. "It's bad, isn't it? You have that look adults get when they don't want to say something sad." Evan almost smiled at how precisely she read him. In such a short time, she could interpret his expressions better than executives he'd worked with for years. "Your dad needs surgery, Hallie," he said, opting for honest simplicity. "His kidneys are very sick." Fear immediately took over her face. "Is he going to die?" "No, no," Evan hurried to say, placing a hand over her small one. "Not if we do the surgery. It's a transplant. He needs a new kidney to replace the ones that aren't working." "Where do we get a new kidney?" she asked, always practical, always seeking to understand. "From a donor," Evan explained. "Someone who gives one of their kidneys. We have 2, but we can live perfectly well with just 1. Hallie processed the information, her brows knitting in concentration. "And where are we going to find someone who wants to give Dad a kidney?" There was so much vulnerability in that question, so much implied fear, that Evan felt a lump in his throat. This child had already lost so much, endured so much hardship. The thought of not finding a donor in time was another burden she shouldn't have to bear. "We don't have to look," he said gently. "I'm going to give your dad one of mine." Hallie's eyes widened. "You can do that." "Yes, I'm running tests today to confirm we're compatible, but since we're twins, it's almost certain we are." "But won't it hurt? Won't you get sick too?" The genuine concern in her voice for him moved Evan deeply. "I'll be fine," he assured her. "Yes, it'll hurt a bit after the surgery, but the doctors will give me medicine for that. And in a few weeks, I'll be completely recovered." Finn chose that moment to clap his hands happily, utterly unaware of the gravity of the conversation. The innocent sound contrasted with the tension filling the moment. "What if it doesn't work?" Hallie asked quietly, voicing her biggest fear. "What if Dad doesn't get better, even with a new kidney?" Evan considered the question. It would be easy to offer empty assurances, but Hallie deserved more. "There are risks in any surgery," he acknowledged. "But these doctors are very good, and they'll do everything possible to make it successful." Hallie's eyes filled with tears she fought to contain. "I'm scared," she whispered. Without thinking, Evan pulled her into a hug, and for the first time, she didn't resist. Her small arms wrapped around him with surprising strength, as though he were an anchor in a storm. "I'll take care of you, Hallie," he promised, emotion thick in his voice. "No matter what, you 3 aren't alone anymore." Finn, noticing the hug, stretched out his little arms to join. Evan included him, feeling the baby's warm body snuggle against his chest. Right there, in the middle of a hospital playroom filled with colorful toys and smiling animal posters, Evan Morgan made a silent promise. Not only to Hallie and Finn, but to himself. This was his family now, and he would stay. Not because genetics dictated it, not because he and Jake shared a face, but because, for the first time in his life, he'd found something worth fighting for beyond bank balances and corporate acquisitions, something bigger, something deeper, something that finally made him feel whole. The phone call came on a quiet afternoon. Evan was in his makeshift home office catching up on emails, while Hallie and Finn napped, when Dr. Reynolds called with the news he'd been waiting for. "Mr. Morgan, we have your test results," the doctor said confidently. "A perfect match, as we suspected. You're an ideal donor for Jake." Even though he'd expected the confirmation, hearing the words made Evan feel a rush of conflicting emotions: relief, nervousness, resolve. "When can we schedule the surgery?" he asked, regaining composure. "In about a week, I believe. Jake is responding well to dialysis and should be strong enough by then." After hanging up, Evan faced a practical issue he hadn't resolved yet. Who would take care of Hallie and Finn during his recovery? Both he and Jake would need to stay in the hospital for days, followed by weeks of rest. He immediately thought of Ellen Whitaker, his former housekeeper, a woman in her 60s who had known him in his teens and stayed in touch occasionally. If there was anyone he trusted to watch over the children, it was her. The call to Ellen was brief and direct. In a few minutes, Evan explained the extraordinary situation and asked if she could temporarily move into the mansion. "Of course, dear," she replied without hesitation. "Those poor little ones need stability. I'll be there tomorrow." With that settled, Evan prepared for the more difficult conversation. He drove to the hospital alone, taking advantage of Hallie being occupied with activities provided by a social worker. Thursday Usama Jake's room was decorated with colorful drawings Hallie had made in the past few days. There were houses, trees, and stick figures representing the family, now including Evan, always depicted in a suit, even when he wore casual clothes. Jake looked better, less pale, sitting up in bed reading a book Evan had brought the previous week. "Hey," he smiled, looking around. "Where are the kids?" "At home," Evan replied, sitting in the chair by the bed. "I needed to talk to you alone." Jake's expression grew serious. "What's wrong?" "Actually, I have good news. About the transplant. They found a matching donor." Evan took a deep breath. "Yes, me." The silence that followed was heavy. Jake stared at him with a mixture of confusion and disbelief. "You?" he finally asked. "Why?" "Because I'm a match. A perfect match." "But why would you do that? You barely know me." Evan leaned forward. "Jake, I think you suspect it already. Since the first moment we met. That we look alike," Jake tried to deflect. "That we're brothers," Evan corrected gently. "Identical twins." Jake turned his face toward the window, silent for a long moment. The only sound in the room was the steady beep of the monitors. "When I was a kid," he said at last, "I used to imagine I had a brother somewhere, someone who'd understand me, who'd come find me." His voice cracked slightly. "Then I gave up on that fantasy." "It wasn't a fantasy," Evan replied. "I did some preliminary research. We were born in St. Mary's Hospital. I was adopted at 6 months by a wealthy family. You stayed in the system until I was 2, Jake finished. "Adopted by the Carters. Good people, just didn't have much. They died in an accident when I was 19. Another silence fell. 2 lives that started in the same place, diverging so drastically. "Why would you be chosen right away while I waited?" Jake asked, his voice low, revealing an old wound. "Maybe you were stronger. The favorite." The pain in those words was so raw, Evan felt it physically. "You probably had everything," Jake continued. "Best schools, best opportunities, built an empire." "And you built a family," Evan replied without hesitation. "Hallie and Finn, the love they have for you, how you protected them even in the worst circumstances. That's worth more than any empire." Jake blinked and surprised by his answer. A tear escaped, rolling slowly down his cheek. He wiped it quickly, looking embarrassed. "Sorry," he murmured. "I never cry in front of anyone, not even Hallie. She needs to see me strong." "Maybe that's why she's so strong," Evan observed. "She learned from you." Jake shook his head, unable to accept the compliment. "Look, Evan, I appreciate the offer. More than I can say. But I can't accept." "Why not?" "Because you don't owe me anything," Jake said firmly. "We're not responsible for each other just because we share DNA. You have your life. You've already done more than enough, taking care of the kids, paying for this hospital." "No," Evan interrupted, feeling a determination he rarely experienced. "This isn't about obligation. It's about choice." Jake looked at him, confused. "What do you mean?" "You don't owe me anything," Evan repeated Jake's words. "And I don't owe you anything." His eyes met his brother's. "No, but I choose you." Something broke in Jake's expression. A barrier, a wall he'd probably kept up for years. His shoulders started to shake, and for the first time in front of another person, Jake Carter cried openly. Not just silent tears, but deep sobs that seemed to come from decades of lonely struggle. Without hesitation, Evan stood and sat on the edge of the bed, wrapping an arm around his brother's shoulders. Jake leaned into him, allowing himself to be comforted for the first time in years. "It's going to be okay," Evan murmured. "You're not alone anymore." A grey-haired woman with kind eyes arrived the next morning, and Hallie watched cautiously as she spoke quietly with Evan in the living room. There was something comforting about this older lady, with her calm voice and genuine smile. She wasn't pushy or fake like the social workers Hallie had learned to fear. "This is Mrs. Ellen," Evan introduced. "She looked after me when I was a kid." "You can just call me Ellen, dear," the woman said, not trying to get too close or force a connection. "Ellen will stay with you while your dad and I are in the hospital," Evan explained, "and then during our recovery." "For how long?" Hallie asked, ever the practical one. "A few days in the hospital, then some weeks recovering at home." Hallie studied the lady again, evaluating her with eyes that saw more than they should. "You've known him a long time?" she asked Ellen directly. "Since he was about your age," Ellen replied with a smile. "I taught him how to tie a tie and never told anyone when he cried." That small detail, shared so simply, seemed to win Hallie over more than any formal reassurance could. On the eve of the surgery, Hallie and Finn visited both brothers in the hospital. Jake and Evan had been admitted to adjacent rooms for pre-op preparations. Hallie went back and forth, serious and determined as always. "You're both going to be fine," she said firmly, not as a question but an order, like her determination could ensure the outcome. "We will," Jake promised, squeezing her small hand. "And then I won't need dialysis anymore. I'll have more energy to play with you and Finn. And make pancakes," Hallie added. "You promised? Pancakes will be the first thing," Jake smiled. Before leaving, Hallie handed each of them something. Carefully folded paper flowers, yellow for Jake, blue for Evan. "For good luck," she explained. "The art teacher in the playroom showed me how." Ellen gently ushered the children out, letting the brothers rest for the big day. "We'll be here tomorrow right after the surgery," she promised, giving Evan a meaningful look that said she'd take good care of them. The next morning, medical teams prepped both brothers for surgery. Evan went into the operating room first, placing the blue paper flower carefully on a table nearby at his request. "We're ready, mister." "Morgan," Dr. Reynolds said. "Any questions before we begin?" Evan shook his head. He had no questions, only certainty, a certainty that, for the first time in his life, he was exactly where he needed to be, doing exactly what he needed to do. As the anesthesia took hold, his last thought was of Hallie and Finn, and of the brother he never knew he had, but whom he now couldn't imagine living without. Hours later, Evan woke in the recovery room, feeling a dull ache in his side. When he managed to open his eyes completely, he found Ellen sitting by his bed. "Jake," was his first word, his voice raspy from intubation. "The surgery was a success," Ellen smiled. "The doctors say the kidney is already functioning perfectly." Evan closed his eyes again, this time in profound relief. The following afternoon, against medical advice but with the staff's leniency, the brothers were moved to the same room for a brief visit. Hallie entered, holding Ellen's hand, with Finn in the older woman's arms. The girl's face lit up when she saw them both awake, albeit pale and attached to tubes. "Did it work?" she asked, looking from one to the other. "It worked," Jake confirmed with a tired smile. "Uncle Evan's kidney is already working inside me." Hallie approached Evan, studying his face with that solemnity that made her seem older. Then, to everyone's surprise, she leaned in and kissed his cheek. "Thank you," she whispered. On the table between the brothers' beds, the two paper flowers, yellow and blue, lay side by side, symbols of a hope that, after so long being just a silent wish, was finally taking shape in the real world, a hope that was now their future. Time has a peculiar quality in recovery. It seems both slow and fast, dragging on and yet racing by. For Evan and Jake, the weeks following the surgery held this contradictory rhythm. Long days of discomfort and nights that vanished in a haze of pain meds and restless sleep. Evan returned to the mansion after 5 days in the hospital, adhering strictly to medical advice despite his urge to jump back to work. Jake remained hospitalized longer, 14 days, while his body adapted to the new kidney under careful monitoring. Each morning, Hallie insisted on visiting him, and Evan, still aching from the incision healing at his side, obliged faithfully. "Uncle Evan," Hallie said one morning as they waited for the elevator at the hospital, "do you think Dad can come live with us when he's discharged?" It was the first time she'd called him uncle without hesitation, as though the title had always belonged to him. Evan felt a warmth expanding in his chest, a feeling that was becoming more familiar lately. "Of course," he answered, trying to sound casual, even though it was the most important thing he'd heard all day. "The three of you can stay as long as you like. The house is way too big for just me." Hallie nodded, satisfied. "I think he'll like it. The bed there is better than under the bridge." The simplicity of her observation hit him again, this child comparing a 20-room mansion to a space under concrete, seeing only the practical comfort of a decent bed. When Jake was finally discharged, Evan personally arranged everything. The guest room on the ground floor was adapted to make movement easier, grab bars in the bathroom, a hospital-style adjustable table. The old desk was removed to accommodate medical supplies and medications. "This is overkill," Jake commented upon seeing it. Already sitting in the wheelchair the doctor insisted he use for the first few days. "I'm not an invalid." "Doctor said you need proper rest," Evan replied, helping him transfer to the bed. "Recovery from a transplant is no joke." "Says the guy who's hobbling around, pretending he's not in pain," Jake retorted with a half-smile. That was how it was between them now, light-hearted teasing that masked genuine concern, as if they'd been siblings all their lives, simply picking up where they left off after a long separation. Hallie observed everything with vigilant eyes, soaking in this new normal. Finn, unaware of adult complexities, had fully adapted to the new home, crawling enthusiastically down hallways, discovering hiding spots under tables and behind curtains. And the first week living under the same roof set the tone. Ellen stayed on, at Evan's request and with Hallie's growing approval, becoming a confidant for the girls' stories and a patient culinary instructor. "I can't believe she's baking cookies," Jake remarked one afternoon, while he and Evan played chess on the veranda, both following doctor's orders for light exercise. "She never had the patience to cook." "Ellen has that effect on people," Evan said, moving a pawn. "She taught me to grow ferns when I was 12. I could barely keep a cactus alive before that." Jake smiled, studying the board. "Funny how we became such different people, yet some things stay the same." "Like what?" "That face you make when you're concentrating." Jake pointed at his brother's expression. "I do exactly the same. Hallie always says I look like I'm smelling sour milk when I'm thinking hard." Evan laughed, feeling a twinge in his still healing incision. Continual discoveries of similarities between them had become a source of amusement and wonder. The same way of folding their arms, the same strawberry allergy, the same habit of humming while they read. Their differences, however, were equally fascinating. Jake had infinite patience for explaining things to Hallie, while Evan still struggled to simplify concepts. Evan was invariably up by 5 a.m., while Jake, a night owl, often stayed up reading. Evan organized everything in precise categories. Jake functioned best, amid a structured chaos only he understood. Over the weeks, the household's dynamic shifted subtly but profoundly. Rooms that once echoed with silence now reverberated with a variety of sounds: Hallie's laughter at cartoons, Finn's excited babbling, the brothers' long conversations deep into the night, rediscovering each other. The mansion, once impeccably arranged, now showed unmistakable signs of life. Toys appeared in the most improbable places: a toy car in the potted plant by the entryway, colorful blocks in the cutlery drawer, a teddy bear forgotten in Evan's office. The fridge, once stoically barren except for sparkling water and imported fruit, now overflowed with yogurt in odd flavors Hallie loved, homemade purees for Finn, and leftovers from lasagna Jake learned to make with Ellen. The doctor said you can start taking longer walks, Evan mentioned over breakfast, about a month after the surgery. I was thinking we could go to the park today. All of us, Hallie asked at once, her face lighting up at the idea. Of course, Evan replied, already used to including the children in every plan. We can pack some snacks and spend the afternoon there. Like a picnic, the girl insisted, as though she needed confirmation that she wasn't misunderstanding. Exactly like a picnic, Jake smiled, exchanging a glance with Evan. Hallie dashed off to tell Ellen the news, leaving the brothers alone in the kitchen. She's never really been on a proper picnic, Jake explained quietly. She always talked about it after reading something from the library, but we never had the chance. Evan felt the familiar knot of sadness for their hardships, coupled with a determination to make up for lost time. The outing to the park was the first of many that became part of their family routine. Trips to the zoo on Saturdays, Sunday matinees at the movie theater. A visit to the aquarium left Finn so enthralled that he kept pointing at anything blue for days afterward. To Evan's surprise, he found joy in viewing the world through Hallie and Finn's eyes. Ordinary places he'd never noticed became extraordinary when experienced for the first time. A carousel at the mall, pigeons fighting over crumbs in the park, sunlight reflecting on skyscraper windows. "Look, Uncle Evan," became a frequent refrain, always followed by a discovery Hallie felt was worth sharing. Frisbee was around the third month. An inevitable question arose. The ground floor guest room Evan prepared for Jake was no longer needed. Jake's recovery had advanced to the point he didn't require special arrangements. Hallie and Finn occupied one of the upstairs guest rooms, their belongings still few enough to fit into a single dresser. The question lingered in the air, unspoken but present in Jake's hesitations, in the uncertain looks he sometimes exchanged with Evan. It was on a quiet evening, after the kids were in bed, that Jake finally verbalized what both had been considering. "I think it's time for us to find our own place," he said calmly, swirling the juice in his glass. His health had improved significantly, but he still followed the recommended diet, avoiding alcohol. Evan, reviewing some work documents at the kitchen table, looked up abruptly. "Why?" "We've taken advantage of your hospitality for long enough," Jake replied. "You have your life, your routine, and we're complicated, noisy, messy." "Does that bother you?" Evan asked carefully. "It's not that it bothers me. It's reality. You're a billionaire with an empire to run. You can't really want 3 people messing up your perfect life forever." Evan was quiet for a moment, weighing his brother's words. "You know what I hated most before you guys came?" he asked finally. Jake raised an eyebrow, waiting. "The silence," Evan continued. "The predictability. Waking up every day knowing exactly how every minute would be filled. Meetings, reports, acquisitions, numbers that go up or down, equally empty of real meaning." He closed the laptop, turning fully toward his brother. "Yesterday, I stepped on Finn's toy car in the hallway at 2 in the morning. Nearly broke my neck and I laughed alone in the dark, because that out-of-place toy meant I wasn't alone anymore." Jake opened his mouth to argue, but Evan raised a hand. "Let me finish. Last month, Hallie spilled grape juice on a Persian rug that cost more than some cars. Know what my first reaction was? It wasn't anger. It was worry that she'd feel guilty, that she'd think I cared more about some stupid rug than her being here." "Evan, this house was never a home," Evan pressed on. "It was a property, an investment, a status symbol. You all turned it into something else, something noisy, something unpredictable, something real." The brothers stared at each other for a long, silent moment. "You really want us to stay?" Jake finally asked, his voice more vulnerable than he intended. "More than anything," Evan answered without hesitation. "This isn't a favor or charity. It's pure selfishness. You've given me something billions of dollars never could." "What?" "A family." The word lingered between them, simple and powerful. Jake nodded slowly, making a decision without further discussion. "Then I guess we need to redecorate a few rooms. This house is absurdly minimalist for kids." The tension dissolved in shared laughter. The matter settled without need for formalities. The mansion's transformation happened gradually, without a deliberate plan. The second floor, once reserved for rarely used guest rooms, became the children's domain. Hallie's room was painted a soft yellow and lined with shelves full of books. The room next door turned into Finn's space, complete with a secure crib and colorful mobiles hanging from the ceiling. Jake picked a room on the opposite side of the hallway, close enough to hear the kids but with the privacy every adult eventually needs. The home office, which Evan rarely used, was converted into a small library, reflecting Jake's love of reading, something Evan was more than happy to encourage. The changes extended beyond physical spaces. Evan, who used to delegate all household decisions to staff, now participated actively in discussions about menus, bedtime routines, and screen time rules. Jake, accustomed to bearing all parental responsibilities alone, discovered the relief of sharing the load, and there were stumbles, of course, many of them. Evan had to learn that business meetings couldn't always take priority over school presentations. Jake had to accept he didn't need to count every penny or stash food for emergencies. Hallie gradually understood she no longer had to be the family's adult. She could let go and just be a kid. Even Finn had adjustments, learning that crying at night now brought not just his dad, but also his uncle, both equally concerned and clumsily eager to help. Arguments happened, misunderstandings, frustrating moments. Two strong personalities like Jake and Evan inevitably clashed over issues of parenting, money, priorities. But there was always reconciliation, always an effort to adapt, always the mutual recognition that the bond they were building was worth every temporary discomfort. One Sunday morning, about 6 months after the surgery, Evan came downstairs to find organized chaos in the kitchen. Flour dusted the counter, eggshells abandoned near the sink, and the distinct smell of pancakes filled the air. Jake stood at the stove, flipping a perfectly golden pancake. Hallie, perched on a step stool, stirred something in a bowl with intense concentration. Finn, in his high chair, beat a plastic spoon rhythmically, contributing to the morning symphony. "Uncle Evan!" Hallie exclaimed upon seeing him. "We're making a surprise breakfast." "Which was supposed to be breakfast in bed," Jake added with a resigned look, "but I think we missed the window." "I can go back upstairs and pretend to be surprised," Evan offered seriously. "Don't be silly," Hallie giggled. "We already saw you. Sit down." "They'll serve you," Evan obliged, watching the scene with a feeling of completeness he'd never experienced before. This was his family now. Imperfect, noisy, sometimes complicated, and absolutely perfect that way. When Hallie placed a plate of unevenly shaped pancakes before him, decorated with strawberries, which he technically couldn't eat due to the shared allergy with Jake, he didn't mention it. He just smiled, thanked her, and discreetly slid the strawberries onto Hallie's plate when she wasn't looking. Jake noticed, of course. Same eyes, same sense of humor. "Worth a try," he murmured, passing Evan the syrup. "Always," Evan agreed, and that was their life now, filled with small moments of mutual understanding, silent sacrifices, stumbles and recoveries. A genuine bond, formed not just because of the DNA that had reunited them, but through the daily choice to stay, to try to love. In the mansion's entrance, where once there had been an elegant arrangement of artificial flowers, now stood a vase of fresh yellow daisies, a tradition started by Hallie and carried on by all. A constant reminder of that improbable meeting that turned 4 lonely lives into one family. An imperfect family, a family still learning, a real family. It's curious how time marks its presence, not just in calendars or birthdays, but in the small details that accumulate almost imperceptibly until we look back and see how far we've come. In the Morgan Carter household, those details were everywhere that Sunday morning. In the pencil marks on the kitchen wall, tracking Hallie's growth over the past 8 months. In the colorful crayon scribbles Finn had left on the hallway wall, now framed like a piece of art, instead of being scrubbed away. In the photos proliferating through the house, capturing moments that once would have gone unnoticed, but now deserved to be preserved. Finn! "Bring that back." Hallie's voice echoed down the hall, followed by the sound of rapid footsteps and a baby's squeal of laughter. Evan glanced up from his Sunday paper in time to see Finn, newly confident on his feet, race by triumphantly waving what looked like a hairbrush. Hallie followed close behind, hair half-combed, half-wild, torn between annoyance and amusement. In his first steps, just 2 months ago, Finn was hesitant, swaying like a little sailor on rough seas. Now, it was almost impossible to keep him still. The entire house had been child-proof to accommodate his adventures, edge protectors on furniture, breakables moved up high, baby gates at the stairs. "Gotcha!" Jake appeared from around the corner, intercepting the tiny escapee and lifting him into the air, provoking a fresh burst of giggles. "I believe this belongs to your sister," he said, gently prying the brush from Finn's hands and handing it back to Hallie. "Thanks, Dad," she said, tidying her hair with the dignity of a recently turned 10-year-old. "I'm trying to look nice for the picnic." "You're already beautiful," Jake and Evan said simultaneously, prompting an exasperated eye roll from Hallie. "You have to say that," she replied, though she beamed at the compliment. "I'm going to finish getting ready. Uncle Evan, did you make the sandwiches yet?" "Almost done," Evan replied, folding his paper. "I'll wrap them up now." In the kitchen, long since shed of its showroom look, Evan resumed his Sunday task. Cooking on Sundays had become his personal ritual, something he never imagined enjoying. It started as a necessity. Ellen needed breaks, and Jake was still recovering. Evan had watched online tutorials, burned a few pancakes, made nearly inedible pasta, but persisted. Now he was proficient enough at sandwich making that Hallie declared them almost as good as the ones from the school cafeteria. Coming from her, that was high praise. Jake walked in with Finn still in his arms, watching his brother assemble sandwiches with almost surgical precision. "Who would have thought?" Jake said. "Evan Morgan, the man who used to buy out companies before breakfast, now making peanut butter sandwiches with no crust. With jelly only on the left side," Evan added solemnly. "Hallie hates it when jelly invades the right side. Apparently, it's a severe breach of sandwich etiquette." The brothers exchanged smiles. These small nuances, Hallie's specific preferences, Finn's love of anything blue, Jake's aversion to cilantro, had become shared knowledge, part of their growing family vocabulary. "Hallie's having a hard time with math," Jake mentioned, adjusting Finn on his hip. "Her teacher brought it up at yesterday's meeting." "I can help," Evan offered immediately. "I've always been good with numbers. We can set up study sessions Tuesdays and Thursdays. Don't you have meetings those days?" "I can rearrange my schedule," Evan shrugged, as if shifting the agenda of a billion-dollar empire to accommodate math lessons for a 4th grader was the most normal thing in the world. That was perhaps the most surprising part, how effortlessly Evan shifted priorities. It wasn't a concession or sacrifice, it was simply what one did for family. Hallie reappeared, hair perfectly combed and wearing the yellow dress she'd received for her birthday. "I'm ready, can we go?" As the park on Sundays had become a family tradition. It was the same park where they'd had their first picnic nearly 9 months ago, Hallie experiencing for the first time what it felt like to sit on a checkered blanket in the grass, surrounded by people who didn't have to scrape together change for the next meal. Today, the place was particularly lovely. Early spring brought newly bloomed flowers and a gentle breeze. Under the shade of an old oak tree, Evan spread out the blanket while Jake set up a portable chair for Finn, who was mesmerized by the birds. Hallie, ever organized, began distributing plates and napkins with the precision of an experienced hostess. "Do we have to wait 20 minutes after eating before going on the swings?" she asked, reciting a rule she'd learned somewhere on TV. "Actually, that's a myth," Evan said, handing her a sandwich. "It's okay to play afterward, as long as you're not doing anything too strenuous." Hallie absorbed that information seriously, then smiled. "So I can go down the slide right after I finish?" "As long as you finish everything, including the carrots," Jake added, well aware of his daughter's tactics to dodge vegetables. The picnic unfolded with the easy rhythm they'd developed. Finn made a delightful mess with his fruit puree. Jake told stories about his school days. Evan patiently explained why the sky is blue when Hallie asked, neither oversimplifying nor overcomplicating, a skill he'd honed in recent months. "Remember when we came here for the first time?" Hallie asked, nibbling on her sandwich. "I'd never been on a picnic before." "I remember," Evan said. "You asked if you could take off your shoes to feel the grass on your feet." "And Uncle Evan also took off his shoes," Jake added, "even though they were those expensive Italian loafers he wouldn't let anyone even look at before." "They were just shoes," Evan shrugged, as though it hadn't been a symbolic turning point in his life. At one point, Evan noticed someone watching them, a gray-haired woman on a nearby bench. There was nothing intrusive about her gaze. It was more like a gentle recognition, as if she was witnessing something both familiar and precious. When their eyes met, she smiled and nodded slightly, as though approving of what she saw. Evan returned the gesture, aware of what they must look like to an outsider. Just a normal family enjoying a Sunday in the park. Not a billionaire, a former homeless man, and two kids brought together by a string of improbable coincidences. Simply a family. And that was exactly what they were. After eating, Hallie ran to the swings as promised, insisting Evan come push her really high, almost touching the sky. Jake stayed with Finn, who was fixated on the grass he seemed determined to examine as thoroughly as possible. As Evan pushed Hallie, her laughter echoing with pure joy, he reflected on how much his life had changed. The man who once measured success by quarterly reports and acquisitions now measured it by how high he could push a swing, by the smile of a child, by the peaceful look on his brother's face across the playground. "Uncle Evan," Hallie called, still soaring on the swing, "did you used to go on picnics when you were little like me?" The seemingly simple question made Evan think. "Yes, a few times, but they were different." "How?" "They were more formal, with white tablecloths and real silverware, more like a regular meal just outside." "That doesn't sound fun," Hallie decided. "It really wasn't," Evan admitted. "I think I'm only learning now what picnics are supposed to be like." When Hallie finally tired of the swing, they walked back to the picnic spot. On the way, she stopped abruptly, bending down to pick something up from the ground. "Look, a perfect daisy," she said, showing the small white flower with a yellow center. With practiced skill, Hallie bent the daisy's stem, weaving it back onto itself in a way Evan had seen her do before. In minutes, she turned it into a small craft, a daisy that could be kept without water, without wilting. "For you," she said, handing the paper-like flower to Evan. "This one's to keep, because you stayed." The simplicity of that statement hit Evan powerfully. Because you stayed. As though it was his greatest merit, just staying when he could have walked away. "Thank you, Hallie," he managed, throat tight. "I'll keep it forever." When they reached the picnic spot, Jake watched them approach. Finn contentedly settled in his lap, cheeks pink from the gentle sun. His expression was one Evan recognized well, quiet contentment, the peace of someone who'd finally found his place. Hours later, with the children finally asleep after a busy day, the brothers sat on the porch as they often did most nights. It was a ritual that started during their recovery and continued as a time for adult conversations. "I saw Hallie giving you that flower today," Jake commented, indicating the little craft now resting carefully on the table between them. "She's been making them at school. Her art teacher showed her how." "It's special," Evan replied. "I'm going to keep it in my office and with the others." The others were the numerous gifts he'd received from Hallie and Finn over the months. Drawings, paintings, a lump of modeling clay that was supposedly a dinosaur, the first paper flower Hallie had given him at the hospital. His office, once a shrine to sterile efficiency, now looked more like a gallery of children's art. "Hallie asked me something interesting today," Jake said after a moment of comfortable silence. "She wanted to know how to explain our family for a school project, her family tree, I guess." "What did you tell her?" "That some families are built by birth, others by choice, and that ours is a bit of both." Jake shrugged. "Not sure if that was the right answer. Sounds perfect to me, Evan replied. Actually reminds me of something I was thinking about today at the park. We don't really need to worry about how it started. We just need to keep going. Jake smiled, recognizing the truth in those words. You know, I spent so much time wondering where I came from, why I was separated from you, why our lives turned out so differently. He looked back at the lit house behind them, where both his children slept safe. Now it seems so much less important. Because now you know where you're going, Evan finished. Exactly. They fell silent again, savoring the mild night air. The first months of living together had been marked by adjustments, trial and error. Now they were finding their rhythm, building routines that met everyone's needs. Hallie, who once had to be an adult far too soon, was finally letting herself be a child. Her room, decorated precisely to her wishes, glow-in-the-dark stars on the ceiling and shelves packed with books, had become her sanctuary. Finn, born into precarious conditions, was now thriving in a stable environment, his newly discovered steps growing more confident every day. Jake had regained not only his physical health, but also something more valuable, his dignity. After months of healing, he'd started working part-time at a local library, combining his love for reading with manageable hours that let him be there for his kids. And Evan, the man who once defined success only by acquisitions and profits, now measured it in a completely different way. In the peace he felt returning to a house that was finally a home. On the living room wall, where once only framed degrees and corporate awards hung, now dominated photographs. Hallie on her first day of school in this new life. Finn taking his first steps. Jake being discharged from the hospital, all four of them together at Christmas. Ordinary milestones for most families, but extraordinary for those who nearly missed having them. The next day, when Evan walked into his office, he noticed a small change he hadn't seen before. On his desk, where only reports and contracts used to belong, there was now a new frame. Jake had placed it there. A recent photo of the four of them at the park, genuine smiles, Finn with fruit puree smeared across his face, Hallie in her yellow dress, the brothers side by side, identical and utterly different. Beside the frame was a note in Jake's unmistakable handwriting, to remember what really matters. Later that day, Evan did something he'd never done before. In a crucial board meeting, when an executive asked if he had a family, he answered without hesitation, "Yes, I have a twin brother, a 10-year-old niece, and a nephew who's almost 2. He offered no further explanations or qualifiers. He felt no need to justify how or why these people had entered his life, because family, for him, was no longer defined by legal documents or surnames. It was about presence. It was about choice. It was about staying when you could have left. It was being the man Hallie sought when she fell and scraped her knee. The Uncle Finn called out for when he learned a new word. The brother with whom Jake could share silences loaded with decades of separation and still be perfectly understood. The paper daisy found its place on the main shelf in his office, next to the diplomas and awards that once seemed so important. A simple, elegant reminder that, no matter how far we roam or how separated we've been, we can still find our way back. Not necessarily to a house, but to a family, to the place where we finally belong. If this story touched your heart, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next ones. Leave a like, because it helps this story get recommended to more people. See you in the next story.